that are going on in the world have really been distressing me. I'm sure they have yourself. And some of you may not have even been able to look at the news because you just found it so overwhelmingly depressing, and you just find you can't cope with it. And throughout this time, I've had this phrase that we just heard: the things that make for peace. The things that make for peace. This is a lovely picture that I found as I was preparing by a French painter of the 19th century, Enrico Simone. And it's precisely this moment that he's trying to portray. As Jesus, on that time when he was going into Jerusalem, on the donkey, and he was entering into that place that we so annually celebrate on Palm Sunday. I've walked that road from El Azariah into Jerusalem, and it's quite an interesting walk, because El Azariah, as it's called today, Bethany, as we know it, but today it's known as El Azariah, which is actually capturing in the Arabic Lazarus, the name of Lazarus, the place where Lazarus lived with the two Marys, and where he was raised from the dead. And there's still today a church which is commemorating the tomb of Lazarus, and it's a place of pilgrimage to this day. Whether it is the actual place, we're not quite sure, but it's certainly the same village. And so that road is the same road that Jesus would have taken, because those tracks don't change. They are just the same year, century after century after century. So I've walked that road, and it's quite a moment. You can know exactly where Jesus was when he came to that moment where he was looking over the city, because El Azariah is down in a valley. And you walk up the hill in a steady but quite a substantial slope. You know that you're walking it. You know that it's going to give you a bit of, heart and lung exercise. So you know you're doing it, but you don't see anything of Jerusalem. And then when you reach the top, at this point, suddenly Jerusalem breaks forth before you. And there it is. And it would have been magnificent in the time that Jesus looked over the actual temple that was still in construction, still under construction in his day. That the main part of it would have been built. And it would have been a magnificent site built by Herod. And he looks over Jerusalem and he weeps. If only you had known what made for peace. If only you would have known what made for peace. But it was hidden from your eyes. And Jesus is looking into the future. And he's seeing that Israel, or Judah, Jewish people, they're on a path of self-destruction, and he can see it panning out in front of his eyes. And that one day, the Roman power that was dominant and had actually taken over that part of the world, as we know, was going to come with all their military might and surround it and destroy it and take it down. And Jesus was seeing that future destiny. If only you had known what made for peace. And Jesus still weeps over Jerusalem. I found myself on occasions feeling tears coming to my eyes as I've watched what's been happening in the Middle 2 months ago I came and spoke about anxiety. There's more to make us anxious now in our world today. And that very often acts like a megaphone in our own personal concerns and anxieties. And I spoke about that and how we can actually try to cope with anxiety within our own lives as well as from what we hear about in the world around us, in the events of the world. And so today I want to speak about peace. Peace. And this passage gives us the indication that actually there are things that actually make the peace. Jesus doesn't spell out in these words what those things are. We have to go to other parts of his teaching to begin to piece together those things that make the peace. And that's what I want to do today, is to bring together a number of things that I believe are the things that make the peace. So this is my choice of the things that make. There will be other things, but I do think that these things actually do help us personally to come to peace. But also, if we could but learn as a human race to live in certain ways, they would make the peace, the things that make the peace. And so I was going to have that reading, and the first thing that I want to talk about is solitude. Solitude, which is not an obvious thing to do with peace. But I do believe that actually it is integral to what it is to have a heart that is at peace. I'm talking here not about loneliness, being just alone and feeling that as loneliness. I'm using the word solitude in a particular way to refer to the way in which Jesus went off on his own, to not be on his own, but to be with God, with the one he called Father, and taught us to know as Father. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about solitude. Sometimes when I talk about this, someone comes up and says, I have enough solitude, I'm on my own all the time. And I understand that. And that must be very, very difficult. And some of you may struggle with that sense of aloneness. I'm not really talking about that. That's a different kind of issue. What I'm talking about is the fact that ultimately, if we have faith in God, although we may feel alone, we are never alone because we are always in the presence of God, even if we cannot feel it at that time. But clearly Jesus was someone who actually recognized that even though he was called to a very active public ministry, which exhausted him at times, he actually needed time to be on his own with the one he knew as Father. And Jesus spoke about it. There's an amazing passage in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's the way he talks about how we practice our religious practices and how we do that. I'm just going to put this up. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century philosopher and mathematician, wrote a book called Pensées, his thoughts. And one of his thoughts that I found absolutely insightful, one that I think is luminous for us as human beings. He said this: all men's misery derive from not being able to sit in a quiet room alone. All of humanity's ministry, all of our personal misery derive from not being able to sit in a quiet room alone. Now, you may find that's an odd thing to say. But I think what he is driving at there, and he was a believer, he had an active faith in God. Pascal was trying to explore what Jesus was exploring in that passage on the Sermon on the Mount when he says this. He says, beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them. For then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. And whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. For they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. I think he's talking about what Blaise Pascal was referring to. About the need to get away from human interaction. From what Jesus calls and called throughout this passage in the Sermon on the Mount, doing our religious practice before other people, before others. Now, in this passage, I think Jesus was opening up something that was a deep psychological insight that is so important for us to get hold of. And I've come to see the radical insight that Jesus had at this time. And in fact, there are thinkers today that are exploring precisely what Jesus was talking about here. And that there is one thinker that has actually seen the significance of what Jesus is talking about here and has made it the whole basis of the way in which he understands how we as human beings operate. That actually we live our lives and we think that we are living them out of our own choices and desires. And this particular thinker says that's rubbish. That's what he calls a romantic lie. We don't just do things simply out of our own desire and our choices, our thinking and our saying, I want to do this, I want to do that. In fact, it's much more complicated than that. Because although we may have an element of that, much of what we desire is in fact put within us because we desire what other people desire. Why are there trends and fashions in human societies? Why does advertising work? It's because basically we are people that copy one another. And an ancient thinker that we all have heard of, Aristotle, said that human beings are the most powerful creature in being able to copy other people. Of all creatures, we are the most mimetic. In other words, we copy one another. And Jesus was aware of that. That we live out our lives being very conscious of how we are coming over with one another. We may not be conscious of it, but this thinker that I've been referring to, a guy called René Girard, said, we're doing it all the time. And it basically means that we need, in order to find our true self, we actually need to get away and create some time and space so that we can be on our own. And Jesus knew this. And so Jesus says concerning not just prayer, but concerning almsgiving and fasting, he said, he uses exactly the same language. Get away and do it in secret. Have a place that you go to where you can get away and you can just be mean by solitude? It's the place of prayer. And prayer is not just thoughts. It's not just ideas and words that we think up and we turn to God. We've been praying now through thoughts and words, and that's part of prayer. But at root, prayer is not just words and ideas. It's a consciousness of presence, of being in the presence of God. At its very heart and core, that is what prayer is. It's not anything that we do, think, or say, primarily. It may have that element. But at its heart, it's with me. I am yours. You are mine. And so we need solitude. Why? Because solitude, in that kind of prayer that I've been talking about, we become aware of ourselves. Helen and I have led retreats in the past. And on one occasion we had someone who came on retreat. And she was very afraid of having times of the silence that we had at this retreat. She didn't know how she was going to cope. She's a very vivacious, social sort of person, and she thought, how am I going to cope? And she came on our retreat, and actually she coped very well with silence. But she did say this: silence is very noisy. And when you do try to be quiet, one of the things that you notice is that your mind is going like the clappers. You start to concentrate and you think about God. And then all these thoughts come in and bombard you, so that in the end you think, oh, stop, I can't pray. And you feel as though you're a failure. But you're not. That's just part and parcel of what it is to be a human being. And one of the things I do regularly in my prayer is I become conscious of precisely those thoughts that I'm having, those feelings that are generated within me. And I say to them, hello, joy. Hello, excitement. Hello, anxiety. Hello, struggle. Hello, feeling rotten. Or someone, something that comes to my mind. Hello. In other words, prayer is to do with identifying those very things and seeing that they're going on within you and becoming aware that actually God still loves you and accepts you with all those turmoil of thoughts. Prayer is about becoming self-aware. And also becoming aware of others and their impact upon you. That person that gets under your skin. Or that person that lifts your heart and your spirit. You can pray about that. That's a part of prayer. And in fact, the very act of being in solitude and actually having the chance to do that starts to equip you to be able to interact with people in a better, more wholesome way. In other words, we have need for time and space. I believe we all do. Even the most gregarious of people. In fact, the most gregarious of people need this probably more than anyone else. But all of us, without exception, need to go into our room and close the door. When Jesus used that word, go into your room and close the door, he didn't use the normal word for room. There's a normal word for room, but he didn't use that word. He used another word for room. He says, go into your inner room, your safe room. And he was using a word that was used to describe a special kind of room that was only found in the biggest of houses in that time in which he lived. In other words, a room that was shut away where you kept all your private conversations and all your personal documents and anything that was valuable. It was the safe room. And when Jesus used that word to people, people would have said, oh, he's using a picture. Because in those days, they didn't have an inner room. If you were just an ordinary person, there was just one big room, and everyone was in that one big room. Where was Jesus' inner safe room? It wasn't in a room at all. It was out there on the mountain as well. Find your safe place. Find that place. Go into it. Shut the door, says Jesus. Pray to you. And this starts to be the dynamic within your life. Oh, these things are going on within me. This person is coming to me. This person is praying. And as you actually bring that person into God's place, it starts to bring you into a place of faith. We live in a highly reactive culture where we bounce off one another, and it's getting faster and faster because basically of this thing called the mobile. We can always be contacted. We are always being exposed to these dynamics. And so we're bouncing through life more and more. And life becomes more frenetic. And things happen at such a speed within our society. Some atrocity takes place. And we find that within just a matter of hours, there can be an impact worldwide. We live in a very different world because of this very highly reactive culture. Solitude, I believe, slows that reactive culture that we're a part of. It slows the way in which we interact with it. And it helps us to live more authentically out of our true faith grounded self. Let me tell you a story. Go back to August in Jerusalem. A Jewish boy kicks his football and it goes over into a Palestinian goal. He goes over and tries to reclaim it. It leads to a fight in which he is stabbed and he dies. And so after the funeral, the Jewish community in Jerusalem have a demonstration. A few days after that, the imam in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the Temple Mount, a very holy place for Muslims, preaches a sermon and says basically that the Palestinians are being oppressed. And so there is uproar between the Jewish community and the Palestinian community. And well in excess of 100 Jewish people died, and over 100 Palestinian people died. That was in August. You didn't hear about it because it happened in 1929. 1929. August 1929. 22nd and the 23rd of August, hundreds of people in both those communities lost their lives. And it's been happening ever since. Jesus knew that we were in a reactive culture where there can be a cycle of goodness or there can be a cycle of violence. And if we are ever going to be at peace, we need to get into our inner room. But if we're ever going to be peace givers and peacemakers in the world, we're going to have to come from a place of peace. And we need wise leaders, people who are statesmen and women, who will lead cultures not to be so reactive. What are people saying now about 9/11? People are saying, Americans are saying, we made mistakes after 9/11. We overreacted. And we didn't do the right thing. But the sheer momentum of reactive culture took over. That's why we need solitude. If we're going to know peace within and without. Oh, you knew what made it. But it was hidden from you. And Jesus wept. It's still good. Solitude. Secondly, listening. One of the things I notice about Jesus is that he's emphasized that we need to be alert. We need to wake up. I don't know whether you noticed, but on 2 occasions, he uses the word, if you had only recognized or known what made them. If you had only recognized it. And throughout Jesus' ministry, he was trying to wake people up. And a way of understanding this is that salvation is not to do with just going, as it were, and getting our ticket booked for heaven. If we talk of salvation in those terms today, it won't make sense to anybody because we just don't think in our culture in those terms at all. It just doesn't connect with people. But what does connect is that we need to become more aware, more conscious, more alert, more present. Salvation is a process of becoming increasingly conscious. Jesus, when he began his parable, said, listen. Sometimes he said, watch. And he would repeat it time and time again. Just read your Gospels. And don't just flow over the words. But see the way that he's trying to awaken people. And he's saying, wake up. The kingdom of God is close. It's not far off. You don't have to be up there in Jerusalem. You don't have to be there or here or everywhere. It's here. It's among you. Wake up. Become more conscious. And one of the things that we have to do, and I'm just using listening as the way into this. It could be see. Open your eyes. But learn to listen. One of the things that we know is that when you're not listened to, it does something to you. Something in you withers. You can't be bothered to go on. You think this person is really interested. You pick it up just subconsciously. You may not even think it, but you just dry up. But someone who really listens and gives you attention, you suddenly find you're opening up. You're expanding. You're exploring something. Listening is a way of living that we're called to do as a believer. And especially to those who are unlikely, those who are different. There's tragedy in what we're witnessing today, isn't it? In the Middle East, yeah? Tragedy. Absolute tragedy. One of the factors at the beginning of that tragedy was what happened in this country in 1917. There was a thing there, you've probably heard it referred to in the last few weeks, the Balfour Declaration, 1917, in the middle of the First World War. Our Foreign Secretary, Balfour, made a declaration that what we now know as Israel, or in that time the territory that was overseen by the Ottoman Empire, as it was then called, Turkey in other words, was to be a homeland for Jewish people. It was declared to be a homeland for Jewish people, provided it didn't actually disadvantage the people who were already living there. Do you know how many people were living there in that area at that time? Something over 500,000 people were living there. 500,000 of those people were Palestinians who were Islamic in their faith. 500,000. There were 60,000 Jewish people there at that time. There were 60,000 Arab Christian people there at that time. And Balfour and the British government declared that, having listened to the Jewish community, but as far as I'm aware, they did not engage with anyone from the majority community, which was 500,000 people at that time. You had a culture there that was ignored by the dominant colonial power that was in existence at that time, British Empire. And when they were successful in the war, in the First World War, they received the mandate to control that area of the Middle East. And so it was under colonial auspices of British power that British power had not listened to the local community, the 500,000 people that were there. That was tragic. And it was a profound error. And ever since then, that Palestinian community has felt a resentment. If only that beginning had happened in a more sensitive way. If only. If only you had known what made the peace, but it was hidden from you. Listening, so forgive. And with this we end. Glad to hear that the practice of forgiveness is so important. Another British thinker, in the late 17th century, a guy called Thomas Hobbes, wrote a very important book that has influenced political thinking through subsequent generations. He wrote a book called Leviathan. Basically, he said that conflict is endemic to the human existence, human culture. It is the way that we naturally are. It is the way of nature. And when you look at human history, you can only say, true. It's just conflict after conflict after conflict. Jesus said there is another way. It's the way of grace. It's the way of learning to forgive. And it's a hard way. Those of you who have been deeply hurt know that Jesus said, look, it's the only way to live. In a world where human creatures are so frail, so prone to mistake, we have to learn the way of forgiveness. And that's why we're here in church. We're here to learn how to forgive, how to live together. That's why we do church meetings in the way that we do. Because it's an experiment. It's a schoolroom where we're learning to actually live with our differences and overcome them. You know what it's like when a church goes wrong in its culture. It's even more tragic when that happens because we are the people that think we've got the answer in Christ. Oh, if only we knew what made the thieves. Only we knew. We think back and we think, oh, if only we had been handling this situation differently, it might not have turned out in this way. If only. So these things aren't abstract. They're not theoretical. They're to do with the way that we live as human beings. And that church is the place where we are learning to forgive. How many times must I forgive, says Peter to Jesus? 7 times? Thinking he was really bigging it up. 7 times. I'm willing to forgive, Jesus said. 7 times. In other words, this has got to become the habit of your life. Forgive. Friends, this is no easy path. But it is the way of grace. It is the only way of hope. So we need solitude and develop that habit of solitude. We need to listen to God, to one another, especially those who are unlikely. And we need to practice forgiveness. And so, friends, this is what we're on. This is our pathway. This is what we're called to. If only you had known what makes the difference. Let's indeed explore what Jesus longed for Jerusalem to know. We have some of the tools. I've touched on 3 that we need to be attentive to. Let's now